Welcome to Chapter 7, Gathering Materials. Before we get into Chapter 7, I just want to go ahead and go over a couple quick reminders. First, make sure that as we go through the presentation, you're taking notes, as this will become your study guide for both the test and for the final. Make sure that you read through the chapter. Additionally, after reading through the chapter, you should be able to define and apply the key terms, along with answering the questions at the end of the chapter. So, Chapter 7, Gathering Materials. So, up first, one of the first places we can always begin to think about with speeches, whether they're informative or persuasive in nature, is drawing upon our own personal experiences. What do we consider ourselves to be an expert in? What do we have lots of experience with? What do people come to us to ask questions about? So once we have kind of gone inward and looked for the information that we might have, we then need to go outside of ourselves and begin to do some research. So one of the best places to go to begin the research process is to think about our library. Obviously, at the high school, we have Miss Saragnano in the library, as well as when you go off to colleges and institutions, you're going to have a general library, and then you're going to have college-specific libraries. So some of the resources within the library are going to be the librarians themselves, catalogs, reference works, newspapers, periodicals, databases, and then, of course, academic databases. As time goes on, information becomes more digital. So there might be lots of books on the shelf in the library, but there's even more resources that are accessed through a computer terminal. And many libraries, to include our own, you can even get access to some of the materials remotely from your computer at home. So let's take a look at some of these particular items here. First up is the catalog. When I was in high school, the catalog was a card catalog. It was a large cabinet that had little 3x5 note cards, and every book or piece of information the library had was on a note card, and you had to weed through that information. Now the catalog is all digital, and it allows you to search much better. So the catalogs are just a list of the books, the periodicals, and other resources owned by the library. Not only can you sort by author, but you can also search by subject, and even a lot of times you can even narrow your searches further with the electronic catalogs. So then we have the idea of reference works, and these are going to be works that synthesize large amounts of related information. So this is kind of your go-to source on topics. There won't necessarily be a reference work or reference material for every single topic, but there's quite a bunch of collections out there that you can choose from. So some reference works that you might have been exposed to might be encyclopedias. We think about Wikipedia being an electronic encyclopedia, yearbooks, quotation books, and biographical aids. Next up are the databases. And for the most part now, all the databases are electronic. And like I mentioned before, a lot of times databases just require a username and password to access. So you don't physically have to be inside the library to obtain access to those. But databases up first are going to be the ones that cover the newspaper and periodical. And there's going to be articles from magazines, journals, and newspapers. And that's an easy way to access a wide range of materials. Depending on the database you access, some of them are going to have a wide variety of material, others might be more focused. When you get to college, whether it's a 2-year, 4-year public or private, as you begin your career path and you get into your college specific library. So, for instance, if you're going to be an engineer, there's an engineering library. If you're a teacher, there's a teaching library. If you're going to be in the business, they have a business library, those kind of things. So within each one of those particular libraries, they have academic databases. And like I said before, these databases you're going to be able to access electronically via your computer with a username and password. But these academic databases are going to be articles from scholarly journals. So if you're an engineer, for instance, you might be pulling articles from the engineering databases. Or if you're going to be a teacher, from all the educational resources, those kind of things. And the databases are the best place to find scholarly research. When we talk about the idea of scholarly research, what we're looking at is research that is done by experts, and then it is looked over to make sure that it is accurate. So a lot of those journals and publications, in order for a paper or article to be published, it first has to be what's called peer-reviewed, meaning that the author submits it to a group of experts in the field. They look it over to make sure that first it is actual material that is representative of what the author is claiming, and secondly, they're looking for major red flags to make sure that it's actually legitimate research and it's also a legitimate topic. So one thing when you get into the academic research, you're going to come across something that's called an abstract. When we think of an abstract, this is the summary of the material. So think about a book. When you pick up a book off the library shelf, flip it over to the back, and there's a quick paragraph about what the book is over. Also, you can think about a DVD or Blu-ray, same thing, flip it over to the back, and you'll see a quick paragraph of what the movie is about. The thing we have to be careful of with the abstracts is a lot of times they're not the actual work or words of the author. A lot of times the publisher summarizes and synthesizes the articles or materials content into a single paragraph. So that's why we never want to cite the abstract alone, because it's not the author's original work. Next up is internet searching. Most of us, when we go to begin to do some research on topics, whether it's for a speech or a project, the first thing that we go to is Google. Google is a search engine just like Bing for Microsoft, and there's all kinds of other ones out there as well. Safari for the Apple product, those kind of things. But those are all search engines that take you to the information. And some of those allow you to further specialize in particular resource selection and searching. So some specialized resources that you might access at some point might be virtual libraries. So for instance, you can go virtually to the Library of Congress and access some of their information without physically going into the building. And government resources, whether they're published online or printed and available through particular branches or offices, and online encyclopedias. One of the largest encyclopedias and the most prevalent one today is Wikipedia. Wikipedia is the biggest encyclopedia ever created, maintained, and published. Its reliability is comparable to traditional encyclopedias. And encyclopedias are nothing more than a large collection of information. And it's a good place to start, not to end. One of the best things about Wikipedia is how a lot of the articles now over content and subjects provide a bibliography at the end for you to go and click onto other websites to get additional information. So Wikipedia is kind of like that abstract, if you will, to all of the information that's out there on the internet. So it's a great place to start. So you can start doing some research on Wikipedia, and then for a lot of topics, it'll link you to other websites. So as we're doing our research and gathering our materials, what we need to do is we need to evaluate the documents that we're coming across. We need to take a look at three important factors. First is authorship, second is sponsorship, and third is recency. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the authorship. We're looking for an author that is credible on the topic and subject and is an authority figure. So if we run across an article from Johnny's mom's blog it's probably not as credible as something from Johns Hopkins University if we are studying childhood cancer. Next is sponsorship. Sponsorship just simply refers to who is putting out the information. So if we're doing a persuasive speech on reducing guns on the street, we might find some information from the NRA, the National Rifle Association, or we might find some things about Mothers Against Gun Violence. Both organizations are sponsoring the information that they are putting out there, and each organization is providing only the information that suits their needs and their perspective on the issue, not the entire issue in itself. So we have to be careful with sponsorships when it comes to documentations and materials, because a lot of times sponsored material or material from specific organizations or companies can only represent one side of an issue. And then finally, recency. Some topics, the information really doesn't change. So for instance, if you were doing a speech over the history of basketball, the history and the story of basketball really hasn't changed. So that material, whether it's from the 1980s or from 2020, the material is going to be just as equally represented. But if we were doing a topic on the United States and its military, if we would be referencing stuff from the 1970s and 80s about the Soviet Union and how they were our biggest enemy at the time, now when we look at 2020, Russia is one of our greatest allies. So it's important to make sure that we take a look at the recency of the information, especially when you're choosing topics that are ever evolving and on the cutting edge. Sometimes when we're putting together our speech presentation, we have a couple of gaps, or we know the information and we just need some sort of credible source to support what we want to say. And that's where a research interview can come into place. A lot of times we're looking for specific information and we might not particularly be able to find it. So if we're doing an informative speech on medical school and how to become a doctor, we might not find a whole lot of information about the hours that students or doctors put in. So we might have to go do a research interview and talk to both some students who are in medical school or some doctors. So the purpose of that research interview is just to get more information for our speech. So if you choose to do a research interview or an interview of any sort, you want to make sure that you kind of prepare some questions ahead of time. And when you're preparing questions ahead of time, you want to make sure that you avoid questions that are answerable without the interview. So what is your name? What is your title? Those kind of things. Avoid leading questions. And leading questions are questions that are going to provide a specific answer. So for instance, if I stood outside of Walmart and say, do you prefer shopping at Walmart? Most of my respondents would say yes, simply because I'm standing outside of Walmart and they're there shopping. And then hostile or loaded question. So tips for research, whether it's for the informative or persuasive speeches, you always want to make sure that you start early. Because a lot of times through your research, it's going to really solidify your topic. And what I mean by that is simply it's either going to support what you were thinking about your topic, or it might prove that maybe this topic isn't quite right for me. Maybe I didn't know enough information about it, or the information that I thought I knew about it was actually incorrect. So that's why it's important to start early. Think about the materials you want to use. Make a preliminary bibliography and take notes efficiently. We talked a lot about plagiarism in the past, and it's really important, especially when you're submitting materials, that if you are using direct quotations or you're writing a paper in English, for instance, that you're always making sure that you are clearly denoting what is your work versus what you have borrowed from others. So when we think about effective note-taking is going to differ from person to person. Everybody is going to develop or has developed their own system. But what you want to do is make sure that you take plenty of notes over the information. There's nothing wrong with saving the article or printing the article, those kind of things, and having it in its entirety versus just writing down a couple of quotations from it. Record in a consistent format. Once again, this is going to differ from person to person. Some people are going to print the entire article and they're going to highlight what they want to use. Others are just going to copy and paste from the article and place it in and cite it internally and at the bibliography at the end. So it just kind of differs from person to person. You always want to make sure that you have clear, separate entries for your information so that you don't accidentally cross material from one author to another. And then we always want to make sure that we distinguish direct quotations, paraphrases, and our own ideas. Especially when you get into the academic work, when you get into college, a lot of times you're going to be submitting things electronically through the student portal, whether it's Blackboard or the proprietary system of the college you're going. And that electronic submission will automatically be run through their plagiarism software, where it compares your work versus the internet versus others that have turned in work previously to you at that institution and many others. So as we kind of wrap up with chapter 7 on gathering materials, some things to kind of think about here. First, make sure that you have taken notes that you feel will be successful in aiding you to study for the test and comprehensive final. Make sure that you read through the chapter, be able to define and apply the key terms in the chapter, and finally, after reading the chapter, you should be able to answer the questions at the end.